Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Goettl, and today we're going to be talking about the price of prevention, how to translate security actions into business impacts. To help security leaders better demonstrate the impact that they make on an organization's bottom line. So today we've got two speakers from Ivanti who are going to be joining me here today. The first of those is Rob, who is our Senior Director for Solutions Marketing. He's going to be providing us a broader perspective based on industry research. And then we've got Amanda, our Deputy CSO, who's going to be offering a first-person perspective based on her recent experiences completing a BIA exercise here at Ivanti. Before we get started, I'm going to go through a couple of housekeeping items. I'd like to draw your attention to a few features of the platform available to you. If you have any questions you'd like us to tackle during the conversation, please submit those in the Q&A box under the slides at any point during the discussion. We'll be picking them up as we go, and we'll try to get to all of them before we're done here today. On the left-hand side, we've collected some complimentary materials for you to download. So in that tray, you're going to be able to download any of the assets that we've made available to you today. You can explore the topic further and share with your colleagues. Finally, we're going to be running some polls throughout the event, which will pop up on your screen. We'd love to know your feedback, so please do engage with them as they come up on your screen. All right, so let's start out talking about a business impact assessment. Let's start by just talking about the importance of doing this type of assessment and how it can help your organization. So, Rob, we're going to start with you. As far as tools that a business leader can utilize to assess their organization, the impact of things like a cybersecurity incident on the organization, and articulate the value of either doing some additional security activities or not. What type of outcomes can an organization get from doing a business impact assessment?
Yeah, so thanks, Chris. So historically, there haven't been a lot of objective tools that you could use, objective processes you could use to actually do these assessments. And there's been a lot of attention turned to how you go do that, how to make it a bit more objective and a lot less subjective. And it's becoming very important. There's a lot of recognition at the board level. I think it's 88% of boards consider cybersecurity to be a crucial business function for them. So there is a lot of importance around having a process that has buy-in from across the organization, not just in the CISO organization, but across the line of business as well, just to have a shared understanding of what the importance of cyber is and how it gets implemented and what the investment should be.
So this is especially for people who have not done BIA before, it can be a pretty challenging process overall. What types of challenges could somebody expect to run into during a business impact assessment?
Sure. It's probably the biggest challenge to doing a BIA is actually understanding a couple things. And one is the actual financial, both implicit and explicit risks to an organization. You have the explicit risk, which is, let's say, loss of revenue, loss of productivity. And there's a lot of implicit risks as well, which is around factors like impacts to brand and reputation. And those are fairly hard to measure. It's well known that there is those types of impacts. If you look at the press following any major breach to an organization, it's clear that there is an impact, but putting a dollar figure on it can be very difficult. And as a result, being able to tie that back to investment can be pretty challenging.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about some potential approaches to this. Now, there's a couple of different related but separate concepts that you may run into as you look into this. There's the business impact assessment, cyber risk quantification, and then there's articulating the return on investment or the outcome-driven metrics that would come of this assessment. So as you get into this, there's going to be some nuances here that could be confusing as you go into this. Rob, what types of common frameworks exist that can help somebody to do this type of assessment?
Right. So you touched on this. So there's three approaches that, as you mentioned, are all very related. So between BIA, CRQ, and traditional ROI, it's all looking at a lot of the same factors, which is what's the impact to the organization and how do I actually quantify some of these risks that I face, the amount of threats that are out there, how many of those affect me. And again, the challenge is around putting objective numbers around these things. One of the departures from traditional thinking, particularly from ROI, is a newer concept being championed by Gartner called ODM, outcome-driven metrics. And rather than trying to tie the efforts that an organization would go through or the investments that would make in certain product categories, instead they're looking at the business decision of how often do I do a certain activity. So, for example, a good example of that is around patching. And in an ideal world, you'd patch every 5 minutes of every working day, but that's very impractical from a cost and effort perspective. So it's up to the organization to decide what the frequency of doing that particular activity is relative to the cost of doing it, because you run into at some point a lot of diminishing returns. And that has to be a business decision that is decided not just by the CISO organization, but the lines of business as well.
So in a case like that, your ODM, your outcome-driven metric is, in that case, how do we secure our environment more? But then you have to get into that return on investment. To your example, like, hey, if we wanted to be really ultra secure, we'd be checking for new vulnerabilities every 5 minutes and remediate something if it's a threat. The return on investment of doing it that excessively is a huge impact to, your operational, execution, right? So it's finding that balance between the ODM and the point where your ROI is right for your organization. Is that kind of a good way to look at that?
That's a good way to look at it. And again, tying it back to the related concept of a BIA, which is what's the impact to a business for certain types of security outcomes, depending on what type of outcome it is, whether I'm being breached, whether I get loss of connectivity, loss of productivity. And the BIA has to be tied back to, so what are the things I am going to do? How frequently am I going to do them? What software and people and processes does it take to make that happen? So
recently, Ivanti security team was using a specific framework to actually do a BIA within Ivanti. And you guys did a very broad kind of assessment across the entire organization. I know this because I got to participate in it. We actually talked through my part of the business and the activities we do on a regular basis, the different solutions and services that we utilize. And you kind of ran through kind of what would be the impact if this were to go down. So can you explain a bit of, what was driving the BIA that we did internally, and why was this important to try to understand the different parts of the business and their impacts, so you could determine basically what we wanted to prioritize and execute over the next year.
Building off what Rob said, right, where we want to be able to provide not just qualitative, but quantitative information so that we can make decisions. In order to do that, it's critical that you have a holistic understanding of your enterprise, whether that's a smaller or a large organization. There's certain steps that you go through that you can look at the big picture, help to identify where the really critical parts of your business are, and then hone in on those to understand the risks that are associated with those parts of the business. You made the point, it was a question that I had asked while conducting the BIA, is what would happen if this goes down, right? What's the impact there? And then that's really what it's like. But it starts with understanding your business. So it was pretty far reaching, but I enjoyed working with everyone.
Amanda, when you guys were doing this assessment, were there any specific frameworks that your team used, and why did you choose those frameworks?
There's two that I think we relied on most heavily. One is obviously the God tier cybersecurity frameworks for everybody, and that's NIST. I believe it's 853. However, we also dabbled a little bit in the ready.gov resources that are available from the Department of Homeland Security. They've recognized that, in recent years, the entire world has gone through disasters or various events that have largely impacted the global economy, right? Even though they're localized events. And what we're realizing is that we're not isolated, right? We're not our own business in our own little state or city. We're global. We're all connected, right? And so the Department of Homeland Security and the federal government has worked to prepare resources for enterprises of all sizes to help in being prepared in the case of a disaster. So it was those two things that we pulled on the most.
So can you walk through the components of the BIA that you conducted within Ivanti?
Sure. As I said, you start by understanding your business. And the key component, let's say step one, is identifying the mission of your business. What is it that your organization does? What is their sole purpose? That takes interaction with executive leadership. Sometimes businesses have this set up. They've got a whole group of people to do that. Sometimes it takes a little bit of reflection. So once you understand the mission, the purpose, and what you guys are trying to do, then it's identifying all of the processes that support the mission. Now, at the early stages, you're not excluding or narrowing down things. It's very much exploratory. You want to identify everything that goes on in your company, create a little pocket for it. We'll call it a process, right? And so you've got individual processes that support your mission, whether that's the development process, whether that's support, whether that's HR, right? It's these various activities that are going on that you can combine together into a process. Once you get the process from there, it's documenting everything about it. Talk to people, see what goes on, see how that looks, right? And then ultimately you whittle it down from there by thinking about your risk and what's really critical to support the mission. But it all starts in understanding your business.
Ivanti has a fairly diverse business in general. I know that in the conversations we had, we talked about everything from my product management team and the activities that we're doing on a regular basis to things like our patch content creation and the fact that we've got to deliver on very tight SLAs for, let's say, a new Chrome 0 day comes out. Our customers may have very tight turnarounds. We've got to deliver content to them globally in a very short period of time. We've got our on-prem development groups that are creating software for customers that need to deliver on maybe a quarterly basis, not as strict of a timeline there, but our cloud-based solutions, uptime availability for a SaaS-based solution is very different as well. So there was a lot of diversity and complexity within the Ivanti ecosystem, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And that's a result of having your starting point be the mission of the business, not just what do you provide, right? What are you producing or what services do you offer? It's really about where the company is going. So rather than saying Ivanti produces, the individual components of the products that we offer, it's Ivanti strives towards the everywhere type workplace. We want to create a suite of products that can allow companies to provide access to their employees in a secure way anywhere in the world, right? That's the mission. So it's not about, all right, how do we make sure that this product or that product stays up and running? It's how do we support the mission? And that's where it added the complexities. But as you really nicely put it, Chris, it's not hard to take the mission and then say, all right, what processes support this?
Okay, so I'm going to take our first question from the audience here. We've got a question from Steve. He's asking, what data did you need to source and how did you go about it?
When I used the term exploratory for those initial stages of the BIA, it really is. A lot of it is groundwork. It's talking to the stakeholders. Sometimes that starts at department heads because that's a really easy divide for most organizations, HR, sales, et cetera. And then it's saying, okay, you have to walk them through what the objective is and what the end result is and help them understand what a process is, because you're relying on the people who specialize in your various parts of the organization to help you understand which processes exist and why they're important. So it's a really good question. And I know we like to be as data driven as possible. And certainly more mature organizations will have the opportunity to look at things like financial figures. Perhaps it's the number of request tickets that are coming in. Perhaps it's number of events that are happening. I would certainly draw on all of the information that you have available in your organization, but I wouldn't limit it initially when you're trying to decide where you want to focus your business impact analysis initially. I would absolutely do the groundwork and just talk to people and then look at the data and see how it supports it.
As you were doing this, could you quantify in purely financial terms the impact to the business in a lot of these areas? Or if not, why wasn't it necessary in some cases to quantify in financial terms versus just business impact?
Well, for a typical business impact analysis, you're looking at 5 things, right? Financial is certainly one of them. The others are reputational. Then you've got regulatory or social. You've got output, like production, the availability to keep your business running, and environmental impact. Now, you can argue that all of those can be whittled down into just a dollar amount. And oftentimes that's what we strive to do because, finances is the language of business, and that's how we help communicate to leadership and make decisions. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a dollar figure, right? Especially when you get into more fluffier types of impact like reputational, right? What would be the impact to our brand if this event were to occur and we had to respond in a certain way? It takes some finesse and sometimes some creativity, and certainly a lot of input from various people in your organization.
Yeah, and I think to help that process move along is to look at it in terms of magnitude versus exact dollars at the get-go, and even the same in terms of risk that may impact those outcomes. Whether it be low, medium, high, or order of magnitude. I think that would help organizations at least move along the conversation and provide some focus in the BIA activity versus trying to chase all possible outcomes.
Yeah, and I think a good example that I think most of our audience is probably painfully familiar with over the past few years, after you've done the BIA, hey, if a certain part of our business is impacted, here's, the impact that would occur. But if you take a specific event like ransomware, I think, Amanda, to your point, there's a cost quantification you can do there, but ransomware may also have a legal or privacy related and also a reputational risk element that you need to account for in that assessment. So that might be a really good example of a type of threat that you want to use to understand those other aspects besides just the financial piece alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rob brings up a really good point, right? My starting point was understanding the business. But Chris, your first question about the frameworks, I think is really where your starting point is, right? Because in advance, you need to define the things that Rob is talking about, like the various levels of impact. We try to make those as quantitative as possible, but sometimes a low, medium, and high, as long as you define those, can still drive the ability for decision making.
All right, so we have a really good segue here. Our next question comes up, happens to be a lead into what we want to talk about next, which is presenting the analysis to our stakeholders. So the question coming in is, how do you package up and present the information for maximum impact with an executive audience? So Rob, why don't we start with you on this question?
Yeah, I think the first thing to remember is that certainly the higher you go in the organization, the less likely that the audience is going to be familiar with the nuances of cyber and all of the underlying technologies, et cetera. So you have to remember to keep it in a business format because it is a business discussion, and put it in terms that can be understood at that level. And that's the first important step. The other piece is it's less about what the actual numbers are, et cetera. What boards in particular are going to want to know is, how are we doing? And they're going to want to know how they're doing relative to other organizations that they compete against, which is not necessarily a great comparator because, as Amanda talked about earlier, you're looking at your company's business processes, your company's mission, which may actually align better with organizations that are not in the same category as you are versus those that are. And so you have to look at what makes sense for your organization, what risks are present for your organization, and where do you stand in the individual sense, not relative to your competitors.
Amanda, anything you'd like to add to that?
This is just some practical tips, right? Let's just talk real world application here. When presenting to leadership, focus on the most important things first, right? Just display what you want to communicate that is the most important first in as little words and display as possible, right? You want to be direct. At the same time, however, make sure that all the figures and everything that you present to leadership in your back pocket is exactly how you got there. Because what they'd like to see first is what's pertinent and what they need to know to understand the results. But they're going to ask questions. And so being able to back that up by thoroughly documenting your process and having an understanding of all of the steps that you went through to get there, that's what's going to make a presentation like that successful. But I agree with Rob. I think he nailed it on the right points. Okay,
so we're going to wrap up here. On this, I'd like to have kind of parting thoughts from each of you. We've got, both of our speakers have different levels of experience around this. Amanda, very much the hands-on practitioner level. She's been going through and doing these types of assessments many times, including recently here at Ivanti. And Rob with more of the industry level, guidance around frameworks and other things like that. So from each of you, what would be kind of a parting tips, tricks, or thoughts as an organization gets ready for getting into doing their own business impact assessment? And on that, go ahead, Rob. We'll start with you this time.
The first thing to remember is this is not a one and done. And this needs to be an ongoing conversation, business conversation, to guide investment on a go-forward basis. And it's not just providing strategy, but what's the executional plan for it? And providing feedback and the metrics that are going to show, again, where does the organization stand from a risk perspective? How good of a handle do you have on it? And what investments make sense to take those metrics in the right direction?
Amanda, what would be your parting wisdom?
Business impact analysis can actually be pretty fun. I really enjoy them. And so I think what I would suggest for businesses is to be open-minded and be creative, right? You can take the scenario-based planning approach. So when you identify all of your processes, then you get to ask the fun question, what could go wrong, right? And it's really engaging conversation that you can learn a lot from and help other parts of the business think more security minded by just running through exercises like, okay, let's say that, this happened, what could go wrong, right? But especially in keeping the open mind portion, when you think about, when you take a scenario based approach, you'll start to identify things that maybe didn't seem so obvious before. For example, HR is often a critical process. We don't necessarily think that, especially when we're in the tech and the software field, because you're thinking about, how do we keep things running and how do we keep the pipeline moving? But if you have a emergency or disaster in a region, you're going to need to get that up and running somewhere else. And HR becomes really critical in that role. So have fun with it, be open-minded, engage the business. I think you'll be able to make it a success.
And one more thing from my perspective, having been a participant in that, I would say a couple of tips is one, make sure that your participants understand and get engaged. Like, when Amanda's team approached me and really was trying to dig into my part of the business, they had to rely on my expertise to kind of flush out those things. So make sure you're asking the right questions and other things to try to tease out the business critical parts of that. Like, hey, I know what parts of my business are really critical, but having her team ask a few good questions, throw a few examples at me about what if this were to happen, how would this impact your part of the business? Those types of angles really help you to engage with your subject matter experts to make sure you get the full understanding of their part of the business. All right, I'm going to throw in one more question from the audience before we wrap up here today. Allison has a really good question here, which is, what was the biggest challenge that you didn't expect coming across during the assessment at Ivanti, and how did you overcome that? So I think, Amanda, this one's probably very much directed at you.
I admittedly vastly underestimated the amount of processes at Ivanti. Right, I was still fairly new when we kicked off the first BIA that I was a part of, and we had some business units that had 60 plus processes, which is not actually that unusual in more complex organizations, right? It's even more so in what I've seen in some financial organizations. But all we had to do was really, just like you said, Chris, it's communicate with your stakeholders, communicate with your subject matter experts on what the objective is. And once they understand that, it becomes pretty easy to whittle the 60 processes for one of 40 business units down to what's really, really important.
Thanks, Amanda. And thank you, Rob, as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today and participating so actively in the discussion. A quick reminder that you can still download the content available to you on the left side, and I encourage you to sign up for our December webinar, during which we will be exploring how generative AI could be used for the service management, and how is this space likely to develop in the future. So that'll be an interesting kind of look at the continuing development of generative AI as it gets immersed into a lot more of the technologies we use on a regular basis. So hoping to see you there on that event. Thank you.